Of Natalee Holloway finally getting the answers they say they've longed for 18 years after that Alabama teen went missing in Aruba.
Some cases never leave you. They burrow into the collective consciousness of a nation, refusing to fade no matter how many years pass, no matter how many other headlines compete for attention. The disappearance of Natalee Holloway is exactly that kind of case. For 2 full decades, her name carried weight, a name that represented not just a missing girl, but a broken family, a flawed investigation, a media storm, and ultimately, a justice system stretched across international borders trying to reach one man who seemed untouchable. But in 2023, something shifted. After 20 years of silence, lies, retractions, and manipulation, the truth finally came out. And when it didn't arrive with fanfare or triumph. It arrived quietly, in a courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, through the cold words of the man who had spent 2 decades hiding it. This is the full story of how one of America's most haunting mysteries was finally cracked, and why the resolution feels less like a victory and more like a long, painful exhale. To understand why this case gripped the world, you first have to understand who Natalee Holloway was, not just as a victim, but as a person. She was 18 years old in May of 2005, a fresh high school graduate from Mountain Brook, Alabama. By all accounts, she was bright, warm, and full of promise. She had already secured a full academic scholarship to the University of Alabama and was planning a future in medicine. She was the kind of kid who made her parents proud not because she was perfect, but because she was genuinely good. In late May 2005, Natalee joined roughly 120 of her classmates for a graduation trip to Aruba, a small Caribbean island known for its white sand beaches, turquoise water, and reputation as a safe tourist destination. It was supposed to be 5 days of celebration before the next chapter of life began. Her classmates were excited. Her parents gave their blessing. Nobody had any reason to believe it would end in anything other than sunburn and happy memories. On the night of May 30th, 2005, Natalee was last seen leaving a beachside bar called Carlos and Charlie's alongside a young Dutch man named Joran van der Sloot and 2 brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpo. She never made it back to her hotel. The next morning, when her classmates were preparing to fly home, Natalee was nowhere to be found. Her passport and packed bags were still in her room. Her bed had not been slept in. The search began almost immediately. But what followed would become one of the most confusing, frustrating, and emotionally devastating investigations in modern American history. From the very beginning, Joran van der Sloot was at the center of the investigation. He was 18 at the time, the son of a Dutch legal scholar living in Aruba, and he had been seen leaving with Natalee that night. His initial story was straightforward enough. He claimed he and the Kalpo brothers had dropped Natalee off safely at her hotel. But that story quickly began to unravel. Surveillance footage didn't support his account. His timeline didn't add up. And as days turned into weeks, his version of events kept changing. In one telling, he left Natalee on the beach near the Marriott Hotel. In another, the Kalpo brothers had driven away with her. In yet another, he claimed Natalee had wanted to have sex, but he had declined. Each new version contradicted the last, and each contradiction deepened suspicion, while simultaneously muddying the waters for investigators. Aruban authorities arrested van der Sloot and the Kalpo brothers in June 2005 on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. The arrests generated massive media coverage. But here was a problem. Aruban law requires evidence sufficient to justify continued detention at regular judicial review intervals. Without a body, without physical evidence directly linking anyone to a crime, the system struggled. The Kalpo brothers were released in early July. Van der Sloot remained in custody longer, but was ultimately released as well, with all restrictions lifted by mid-September 2005. The investigation didn't collapse for lack of effort. Aruban police conducted extensive searches, draining ponds, combing sand dunes, enlisting cadaver dogs, and even requesting aerial surveillance assistance from the Royal Netherlands Air Force, which sent F-16 jets equipped with infrared sensors over the island. Satellite imagery was compared against earlier photographs to detect any changes that might indicate a burial site. The FBI collaborated with Aruban authorities, testing hair samples and duct tape found during the investigation. Everything came up empty. Tips poured in from all directions, many of them credible sounding, all of them dead ends. What made the situation especially maddening was van der Sloot's behavior throughout. Rather than fading into the background, he kept inserting himself into the story. He gave media interviews. He changed his statements. He cultivated an image that oscillated between cooperation and defiance, keeping investigators and journalists perpetually off balance. It was a pattern that would define the next 18 years. To understand the full scope of what Natalee's family endured, you have to understand just how calculated Joran van der Sloot was, not just in hiding the truth, but in actively exploiting the situation for his own benefit. In 2008, Dutch investigative journalist Peter R. de Vries released secretly recorded footage that appeared to show van der Sloot admitting to being present when Natalee died and to disposing of her body. The footage sent shockwaves through the case. For a brief, electric moment, it seemed like a breakthrough had finally arrived. But van der Sloot dismissed it almost immediately, claiming the statements were fabricated. Lies he told a man he believed to be a drug dealer in order to gain his trust. It was an explanation that was simultaneously plausible and infuriating, and because it couldn't be definitively disproven, it went nowhere legally. Then, in 2010, van der Sloot did something that crossed every conceivable moral line. He contacted Beth Holloway, Natalee's mother, and offered to reveal the location of her daughter's remains. In exchange, he wanted $250,000. Beth, desperate for any answer after 5 years of silence, arranged for a partial payment to be made. Van der Sloot took the money and provided a location. It was a lie. The address led to nothing. The payment, however, led to federal charges in the United States for extortion and wire fraud. And then, just days after the extortion scheme collapsed, van der Sloot traveled to Lima, Peru, where he murdered a 21-year-old woman named Stephanie Flores in his hotel room on the 5th anniversary of Natalee Holloway's disappearance, May 30th, 2010. The timing was chilling. Whether it was coincidence or deliberate provocation remains a matter of speculation, but its effect was unmistakable. It confirmed what many had long suspected, that Joran van der Sloot was not simply someone who had made a terrible mistake at 18. He was dangerous. He was capable of violence. And he had done it before. The Peruvian authorities arrested him, and he was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 28 years in a Peruvian prison. For Beth Holloway and her family, it was a bittersweet development. A predator was behind bars. But he was behind bars in South America for a different crime, while Natalee's case remained officially unsolved. For years, legal experts and investigators doubted whether Joran van der Sloot would ever face justice, specifically for what happened to Natalee Holloway. The jurisdictional complexities were enormous. Aruba had its own legal system. Peru had its own proceedings. And the United States, while it had federal extortion charges pending, had no murder charge to bring, no body, no Aruban cooperation on a murder case, no clear path forward. But the extortion charges gave American prosecutors a foothold. In late 2022 and into 2023, those charges became the mechanism through which van der Sloot was finally extradited from Peru to the United States. He arrived in Alabama, the state where Natalee had grown up, to face those federal charges. And it was within the context of that legal proceeding, facing a U.S. federal conviction, that something extraordinary happened. Joran van der Sloot made a formal, legally binding confession. As part of a plea agreement related to the extortion charges, he admitted what he had done to Natalee Holloway on the night of May 30th, 2005. He stated that he had attempted to sexually assault her on the beach. When she fought back and rejected his advances, he became enraged. He grabbed a cinder block and struck her in the head. The blow was fatal. He then dragged her body into the ocean, where it was lost to the sea. The confession was different from every previous statement he had made. This wasn't a drunken admission to a stranger. It wasn't a story told to manipulate someone. It was given in a formal legal proceeding, under oath, with attorneys present, and backed by specific details that aligned with what investigators had long suspected. Authorities described it as credible. It was the first account Van der Sloot had ever given that was deemed truthful by officials involved in the case. For Beth Holloway, who had spent 18 years chasing this moment, the confession was simultaneously the answer she had always needed, and the wound ripped open one final time. In a statement following the proceedings, she was clear and resolute. Joran van der Sloot was no longer a suspect. He was the killer. Her voice carried strength, but anyone listening could hear the weight behind every word. One of the most painful aspects of this case, one that will likely never be fully resolved, is the question of Natalee's remains. Despite 2 decades of searches, despite cadaver dogs and satellite imagery and F-16 flyovers and drain ponds, her body was never recovered. Van der Sloot's confession explains why, and the explanation is as heartbreaking as it is scientifically straightforward. If his account is accurate, and investigators believe it largely is, Natalee's body was placed in the ocean within hours of her death in 2005. The Caribbean Sea is vast, warm, and full of strong currents that shift constantly. Marine activity, tidal patterns, and the natural decomposition process that accelerates in warm salt water would have, over nearly 20 years, made the recovery of any physical remains virtually impossible. Unlike a grave or a landfill, the ocean doesn't preserve. It disperses. It erases. The searches conducted over the years, the ones in ponds, dunes, and landfills, were based on tips and theories that turned out to be either fabricated or simply wrong. Many of those dead ends were the direct result of Van der Sloot's deliberate misdirection. Each false lead was not just a wasted effort. It was another act of cruelty visited upon a family that had already lost everything. There is always a slim theoretical possibility that something could surface, washed ashore, discovered during underwater excavation, recovered by a diver. But experts are nearly unanimous in their assessment. After this much time in open ocean, the physical evidence is almost certainly gone. For Natalee's family, the confession must serve as the closest thing to closure they will ever receive. It is a poor substitute for bringing her home, but it is the truth, and after 20 years of lies, truth carries its own particular weight. No account of this case would be complete without examining the criticism that surrounded the investigation itself. Almost from the beginning, Aruban authorities faced accusations of incompetence, of favoritism toward Van der Sloot given his father's connections in the local legal community, and of mishandling key opportunities to gather evidence early in the case. Deputy Police Chief Gerald Dompig, who was deeply involved in the investigation, later acknowledged publicly that pressure from Natalee's family had pushed authorities to make arrests sooner than they had planned, before the evidence was fully developed. It was a damaging admission, suggesting that the investigation's early moves were influenced by external pressure rather than prosecutorial readiness. Dompig also floated the controversial theory that Natalee may have died from alcohol or drug intoxication, a claim that Natalee's family forcefully and understandably rejected. Beth Holloway and the broader family were not without their own critics. Some observers accused them of attempting to control the narrative surrounding Natalee's reputation, discouraging her classmates from speaking openly about events on the trip, and using their considerable media access to shape public perception of the investigation. These claims were denied, and the family's grief was genuine and unmistakable. But the tension illustrated just how complicated and emotionally charged the intersection of family, media, and criminal investigation can become. Natalee's father, Dave Holloway, published a book in 2006 laying out his account of the investigation and making pointed accusations of corruption and mismanagement by Aruban authorities. The book added another layer to an already complicated relationship between the Holloway family and the Aruban government, which reached its most dramatic point when American politicians began calling for a formal travel boycott of Aruba in the fall of 2005. Alabama's governor joined the call. Senators and congressional representatives signed on. Aruba's prime minister pushed back forcefully, calling the boycott irresponsible and damaging to his country's economy and reputation. It was a diplomatic mess layered on top of a human tragedy, and it revealed how the disappearance of one young woman could reverberate far beyond the immediate circle of those who loved her. Perhaps no element of the Natalee Holloway case has been more thoroughly analyzed in retrospect than the media coverage it generated. For weeks and months following her disappearance, American cable news treated the story as daily essential programming. Her face appeared on television screens across the country. Her mother became a fixture on shows like Nancy Grace, Larry King Live, and The Today Show, bringing raw emotional testimony into millions of living rooms. The coverage was unprecedented in its intensity, and it was not without consequence. Critics pointed out, sometimes gently, sometimes not, that the massive media attention Natalee received was tied to specific aspects of her identity. She was young, white, conventionally attractive, and from a middle-class American family. The term missing white woman syndrome gained mainstream traction largely in response to the Holloway coverage, as commentators and academics began documenting the statistical disparity between how the media covered missing persons cases based on race and socioeconomic background. Countless missing persons cases involving people of color received little to no national attention during the same period. At the same time, the relentless coverage did serve certain purposes. It kept pressure on investigators at a moment when the case might otherwise have been quietly shelved. It ensured that Joran van der Sloot's name and face remained known to the public, which ultimately contributed to the scrutiny that followed him to Peru and beyond. And it gave Beth Holloway a platform from which to fight, and fight she did for nearly 2 decades. The media's relationship with the case grew more complicated over time. Early coverage was often speculative, emotional, and short on verified facts. Joran van der Sloot was portrayed in quasi-villainous terms that, while arguably accurate in hindsight, sometimes blurred the line between journalism and entertainment. As years passed and the story evolved, true crime documentaries, television specials, and streaming platforms continued revisiting the case, keeping it alive in the cultural memory even as new generations encountered it for the first time. The Natalee Holloway case ultimately became a kind of inflection point in discussions about how the media covers crime, a case study in both the power of public attention and the distortions that attention can create. So where does everything stand today? Joran van der Sloot is currently serving his sentence in a U.S. federal facility following the resolution of the extortion charges. His plea agreement included the formal confession to Natalee's murder, making him legally accountable in a way that Aruban authorities were never able to achieve. He will not walk free anytime soon. The man who spent 2 decades evading consequences for what he did on a beach in Aruba is now behind bars in the country where his victim grew up. Beth Holloway has channeled 2 decades of grief into action. She founded the International Safe Travels Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating travelers about safety abroad. She also established the Natalee Holloway Resource Center at the National Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington, D.C., as a resource for families of missing persons. These efforts don't erase the loss. Nothing could. But they represent something meaningful. A mother who refused to let tragedy be the only thing her daughter's name stood for. The Calpo brothers were never charged in connection with Natalee's death. Based on van der Sloot's confession, the crime appears to have been his alone. Whether they knew more than they ever admitted remains an open question that will likely never be fully answered. And Natalee herself will never come home. There will be no grave to visit, no proper burial, no physical place to go and grieve. She is gone in the most complete and irreversible way possible. What remains is her story, her family's determination, and the hard-won truth that finally emerged after 20 years of being buried under lies. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with cases like this one, a grief that doesn't resolve cleanly, that doesn't offer the kind of closure people imagine when they use that word. The confession that broke open the Natalee Holloway mystery didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like confirmation of the worst fears her family had quietly carried for 2 decades. It answered the question of what happened. It could never answer the question of why, or bring back what was lost. But truth, even when it arrives late, even when it arrives through the cold and reluctant words of the person who buried it, is still truth. And sometimes, when the physical evidence has been swallowed by the sea, when the years have erased the last traces of what was done, the truth is the only form of justice still available. Natalee Holloway deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved the future she had worked for, the life that was taken from her on a beach in the middle of the night by someone she had just met. Her family deserved answers, far sooner than 20 years. The world deserved to know the truth before a generation had grown up in the shadow of the mystery. But the truth is here now. And for a case that seemed for so long like it might never be solved, that is something painful, incomplete, but real. The mystery of Natalee Holloway has finally been cracked, and the world will not forget her name.